وهو العزيز الغفور الذي خلق 7 سماوات طباقا ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت فارجع البصر هل ترى من فطور ثم ارجع البصر كرتين ينقلب إليك البصر خاسئا وهو حسير ولقد زينا السماء طين وأعتدنا لهم عذاب السعير وللذين كفروا بربهم عذاب جهنم وبئس المصير إذا ألقوا فيها سمعوا لها شهيقا وهي تفور تكاد تميز من الغيظ كلما ألقي فيها فوج سألهم خزنتها ألم يأتكم نذير قالوا بلى قد جاءنا نذير فكذبنا وقلنا ما نزل الله من شيء إن أنتم إلا في ضلال كبير وقالوا لو كنا نسمع أو نعقل ما كنا في أصحاب السعير فاعترفوا بذنبهم فسحقا لأصحاب السعير إن الذين يخشون ربهم بالغيب لهم مغفرة وأجر كبير وأسروا قولكم أو اجهروا به إنه عليم بذات الصدور ألا يعلم من خلق وهو اللطيف الخبير هو الذي جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا فامشوا في مناكبها وكلوا من رزقه وإليه النشور أأمنتم من في السماء أن يخسف بكم الأرض فإذا هي تمور أم أمنتم من في السماء أن يرسل عليكم حاصبا فستعلمون كيف نذير ولقد كذب الذين من قبلهم فكيف كان نكير أولم يروا إلى الطير فوقهم صافات ويقبضن ما يمسكهن إلا الرحمن إنه بكل شيء بصير أمن هذا الذي هو جند لكم ينصركم من دون الرحمن إن الكافرون إلا في غرور أمن هذا الذي يرزقكم إن أمسك رزقه بل لجوا في عتو ونفور أفمن يمشي مكبا على وجهه أهدى أمن يمشي سويا على صراط مستقيم قل هو الذي أنشأكم وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة قليلا ما تشكرون قل هو الذي ذرأكم في الأرض وإليه تحشرون ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين قل إنما العلم عند الله وإنما أنا نذير مبين فلما رأوه زلفة سيئت وبيضت وجوه الذين كفروا وقيل هذا الذي كنتم به تدعون قل أرأيتم إن أهلكني الله ومن معي أو رحمنا فمن يجير الكافرين من عذاب أليم قل هو الرحمن آمنا به وعليه توكلنا فستعلمون من هو في ضلال مبين قل أرأيتم إن أصبح ماؤكم غورا فمن يأتيكم بماء معين آمنت بالله صدق الله العظيم. Join me in sending salutations, durood upon our noble messenger sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam in the form of the Qasidah Burdah of Imam al-Busiri rahimahullah ta'ala, reciting chapter number 7, which is related to the Isra and Mi'raj of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The two of his greatest miracles, the glorious Quran and Isra wal Mi'raj, they both have separate chapters dedicated to them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enshroud us in his mercy as he has promised those who send salutations upon our noble messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم يا خير من يمم العفو ساحته سعيا وفوق متون الأينوق الرسوم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم ومن هو الآيات الكبرى لمعتبر ومن هو النعمات العظمى لمغتنم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم سريت من حرام ليلا إلى حرام كما سرى البدر في داد من الظلم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم وبت ترقى إلى أن نلت منزلة من قاب قوسين لم تدرك ولم ترمي مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم وقدمتك جميع الأنبياء بها والرسل تقديم مخدوم على خدم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم وأنت تخترق سبع الطباق بهم في موكب كنت فيه صاحب العالم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم حتى إذا لم تدع شأوا لمستبيق من الدنو ولا مرقا لمستنيم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم خفضت كل مقام بالإضافة إذ نوديت بالرفع مثل المفرد العالمي مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم كيما تفوز بوصل أي مستتير عن العيون وسر أي مكتتم مولاي صل وسلم دائما على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم فحزت كل فخار غير مشترك وجزت كل مقام غير مزدحم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم وجل مقدار ما وليت من رتب وعز إدراك ما أوليت من نعم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم بشرى لنا معشر الإسلام إن لنا من العناية ركنا غير منهدم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم لما دعا الله داعينا لطاعته بأكرم الرسل كنا أكرم الأمم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم يا ربي بالمصطفى بلغ مقاصدنا يا ربي بالمصطفى بلغ مقاصدنا يا ربي بالمصطفى بلغ مقاصدنا واغفر لنا ما مضى يا واسع الكرم مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Continuing with chapter number 68, hadith number 592 of Riyadh al-Salihin. The chapter is piety and leaving that which is doubtful. The next hadith is narrated by Sayyidina Abu Sarwa'a Uqba bin Harith radiyallahu ta'ala. He says, أنه تزوج ابنة لأبي إيهاب بن عزيز. He got married to the daughter of Abu Ihab ibn Aziz. So this is the Sahabi Sayyidina Uqba bin Harith radiyallahu ta'ala. He's narrating about himself, that he got married to a woman, the daughter of Abu Ihab ibn Aziz. فأتته امرأة فقالت إني قد أرضعت عقبة والتي قد تزوج بها. A woman came and she said, she claimed that she had nursed, right? She had breastfed both Uqba and his wife. And so, if this was the case, they would then be brother and sister by way of rada'a, by way of nursing. And the principle in Islam is very clear that any relation which is haram in blood relations is also haram by way of rada'a as well. So if a child is nursed by a woman, she becomes his mother, and her husband becomes that child's father. Her children become that child's siblings. Her sisters become the child's uncles and brothers and sisters become uncle and aunties. And in the same way, any other child that she has nursed also is considered a sibling, a brother or sister of any child that she nurses. And because siblings, obviously, any marriage between siblings is haram, or nikah is haram, in the same way as in those related by blood, those who are related to rada'a, it would be haram as well. So her claiming this basically meant that this marriage would be haram, the nikah would be null and void. They would have to separate. And so فقال لها عقبة ما أعلم أنك أرضعتني ولا أخبرتني. And so he said to her, I didn't know that you had nursed me, or nor did you inform me. You didn't say anything when I decided to get married, and now you're telling me this. فَرَكِبَ إِلَى رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. And so he went to Medina Munawwara, and he told the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. فَسَأَلَهُ, he asked him about this. فَقَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. So he said to the Prophet, he said, Ya Rasulullah, I've married, I've taken a wife, and now this lady claims that she has nursed both myself and my wife. What should I do? And the Prophet ﷺ gave a very short and very simple straightforward, very blunt answer, in fact. Kayfa waqad qila. The Prophet ﷺ simply said, how can this be when it has been said? If somebody's claiming this, if a woman is claiming this, how can you continue this relationship? And so, فَفَارَقَهَا أُقْبَةُ وَنَكَحَتْ زَوْجًا غَيْرَهُ. And so they separated, and then this Sahabi, Sayyidina Uqba radiallahu ta'ala, he married somebody else. Right? There was no choice. It wasn't even a matter of divorce or whatever. That nikah was deemed null and void, and they were separated, and he married somebody else. And this, why is it in this chapter? Because the title of the part of the title of the chapter is Babul War'i. There's two elements. One is Wara', which is piety. The second one is Tarku Shubahat, avoiding things which are doubtful. And so the Prophet ﷺ is saying here that yes, it might just be one woman who is claiming this, because remember, in a court of law, in most matters, you require, at least in an Islamic court of law, you require a testimony of at least two upstanding men, or one upstanding man and two upstanding women. But there are certain matters in which even the testimony of one single woman will be considered binding. And so the Prophet ﷺ here gives an example of this and says, once it's out there, once it's been stated, then you can't change that. And even if there's an element of doubt, you must separate. Sayyidina Hassan bin Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, the grandson of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, Hafiztu min Rasulillahi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I learned something, I memorized something from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is one of those ahadith which gives us an insight into the nurturing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam of his grandchildren, and an insight into raising children from the prophetic perspective. He says, I memorized this from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and remember that when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, when he departed from this world, Sayyidina Imam Hassan radiallahu ta'ala would have been approximately about 6 years old. So not a long time, but he says, I memorized this directly from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Da' ma yuribuka ila ma la yuribuk. Leave that which is doubtful for something which causes no doubt. So if ever you are in a position where you have choices in front of you, and any of those are leaving a doubt in your heart or mind, leave them and go for the safe, secure option where there's absolutely no doubt. This doubt relates to falling into something that may be sinful, may be haram, may be impermissible. Very beautiful, very simple words, but very powerful, and something that can serve as a guide. Remember the last hadith that we finished on last week, where the Prophet ﷺ, demonstrated his knowledge of the unseen as well by telling the person who came to him, saying to him, I will tell you your question as well, that you have come to me to ask me about sin and about good and evil. And the Prophet ﷺ, what did he say to him? He said, ask your heart. Your heart will give you fatwa in this case. That which leaves any doubt in your heart, leave it and go for that which is, because sidq is tamanina, truthfulness is contentment. It will give your heart contentment. See the Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she narrates the next hadith in this chapter. She says, Kana li Abi Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala an ghulamun يخرج له الخراج وكان أبو بكر يأكل من خراجه. She says that my father, Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala, he had a slave who used to earn for him on his behalf, and my father would use that earning to live off. فقال له الغلام, and so this slave, this servant, he said to him one day, فجاء يوما بشيء, he came to him with something one day. فأكل منه أبو بكر, and Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, he had some meal, there was some food, it was something edible, he brought it, and Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala, he ate some of it. فَقَالَ لَهُ الْغُلَامِ, but then this servant, he said to him, he said, تَدْرِي مَا هَذَا, do you know what that is? فَقَالَ Abu Bakr, so Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala, he said, مَا هُوَ, what is it? And this servant, he then said to him, said, Kuntu takahantu li insanin fil jahiliyyah. He said, before Islam, in the time of ignorance, I worked with a soothsayer. Right? So these people who sort of who rely on astrology and other types of knowledge to try to predict the future. Right? This is something that we don't consider in Islam as being a valid sort of practice or form of knowledge. Ilmul ghaib lies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in whatever capacity whoever he chooses to share whatever amount with. But these kind of things, they don't give any kind of definite knowledge, and we don't encourage superstition. And so he says, I used to work with a soothsayer. وَمَا أُحْسِنُ الْكَهَانَةَ إِلَّا أَنِّي خَضَعْتُهُ. And he said that, however, there were times when, in spite of not having great knowledge of astrology, I deceived him into sort of believing whatever I foretold in the future. فَلَقِيَنِي, so he met me. فَأَعْطَانِي بِذَلِكَ هَذَا الَّذِي أَكَلْتَ مِنْهُ, and he gave me this in exchange for whatever I did for him, and this is what you have just eaten from. فَأَدْخَلَ أَبُو بَكْرٍ, what did Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu do? أَدْخَلَ أَبُو بَكْرٍ يَدَهُ فَقَاءَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ فِي بَطْنِهِ. He stuck his finger down his throat and vomited everything in his stomach. He vomited out the entire contents of his stomach. And so the connection here, that wara', that piety, but also doubtfulness. And so he wasn't certain if it was good for him to consume this food that had been taken from or purchased with ill-gotten gains in this manner. And so Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala, immediately he vomited it out. Sayyidina Nafi' narrates that Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu ta'ala, who kana فرض للمهاجرين الأولين 4,000. He had set aside a stipend, a payment of 4,000 each for the early migrants, those who had accepted Islam early and migrated. وَفَرَضَ لِابْنِهِ 3,500. But for his own son, he had set aside a stipend of 3,500, 500 less than what he gave to the others. فَقِيلَ لَهُ, it was said to him, هُوَ مِنَ الْمُهَاجِرِينَ, your son is also from amongst the migrants, also from those who accepted Islam early on, no different from any of the others. So, lima naqastahu, why are you giving him less than the others? Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu's answer, فَقَالَ إِنَّمَا هَاجَرَ بِهِ أَبُوهُ. He migrated with his father, referring to himself, meaning he was young under the care of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu at the time, and he migrated with his father. يَقُولُ لَيْسَ هُوَ كَمَنْ هَاجَرَ بِنَفْسِهِ. And he said, that's not like somebody who migrated himself. Let me just explain that a little bit more. Somebody who's an adult, who's earning off his own means, not under the care of somebody else, or not joining his provisions with somebody else, when they migrated, they left behind everything, their homes, their wealth, everything. His son would have been under his care at the time, would not have had his own independent wealth perhaps, or as much of it that he would have left behind. And so he said, no, I'm not going to treat him exactly the same as those whose sacrifice is clearly greater than his sacrifice. Sayyidina Atiyah bin Urwa, so again that avoiding shubahat and doubts, and Sayyidina Atiyah bin Urwa as-Sa'di, Sahabi radiallahu ta'ala, and he says, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يبلغ العبد أن يكون من المتقين حتى يدع ما لا بأس به. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam very clearly advised, he said, a person can never be included amongst the muttaqeen. Right? Muttaqeen, those people of taqwa, regarding whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Jannah is created for them. أُعِدَّتْ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Jannah has been created for the muttaqeen. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, you can't be one of them. You can't be muttaqi until a person abstains from doing those things in which there is no harm whatsoever. What does this mean? You must also leave those things where there may be a possibility of harm as well. And only do those things which are clear-cut and absolutely certain to be good and positive. So that's very clear. حَذَرًا لِمَا بِهِ بَأْسٍ. He must avoid those things and protect himself from those things in which there is harm, right? And avoid that which lies in between the grey area. Chapter number 69, the next chapter in this text is Babu Istihbabil Uzlati Inda Fasadi Zaman, the desirability of seclusion when matters become corrupted, when corruption becomes widespread. Awil khawf min fitnatin fid deen, or a person starts to live in a time where he fears testing of his deen, of his religion. أو وقوع في حرام, or that he might be forced into or have no option but to indulge in haram. أو شبهات, or even that which is doubtful. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَفِرُّوا إِلَى اللَّهِ. So run towards Allah. Inni lakum minhu nadhirun mubin. Indeed, I am a herald of warning from him, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to you. So this is clear warning from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a few short ahadith in this chapter, inshallah. We'll finish with this, with a few ahadith in this chapter for today. Sayyidina Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas radiallahu ta'ala narrates the first hadith. He says, I heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying, Inna Allah yuhibbul abd al-taqiyya al-ghaniyya al-khafi. Allah loves the person who is muttaqi, who is righteous, has taqwa. Al-ghani, who is independent, doesn't go around begging from others or seeking from others unnecessarily. Al-khafi, the one who is concealed, unknown to the people, not somebody who is presenting himself as I am this and I am that and I am such and such, but rather whatever he is between Allah and that servant. Right? So tries to keep himself concealed. Sayyidina Abu Sa'id Khudri radiallahu ta'ala narrates the next hadith. He says, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, قال رجل, a person said to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, أَيُّ النَّاسِ أَفْضَلُ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. He asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ya Rasulullah, who is the best, the most superior amongst people? Qala, the Prophet said, Mu'minun mujahidun binafsihi wa malihi fi sabilillah. A believer who is struggling, striving, working hard, sacrificing himself and his wealth for the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Qala thumma man, he said, who? Qala thumma rajulun mu'tazilun fi shi'bin min shi'abin ya'budu rabbahu. Then a person who is secluding himself in a valley worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's cut him, for that moment he has cut off his connection with the dunya and he's focused on worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's your connection with detachment from the dunya. He also narrates the next hadith. He says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Yushiku an yakuna khayru malil muslimi ghanamun yattabi'u biha sha'f al-jibali wa mawaqi al-qatri yafirru bidinihi min al-fitan." There will soon come a time when the best wealth of a Muslim will be his sheep, which he takes to the mountain tops and the areas of plentiful rain, escaping in order to protect his religion from tribulation. Know that this time will come. Know that there will come a time when living in society will be so difficult and troublesome that the best option at that point is going to be seclusion. So, number one, we need to try to protect our societies from reaching that point as long as possible. And that's a collective effort from the whole community. But when your deen is challenged, then you need to be ready to make those sacrifices to protect your deen. Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala, he narrates the next hadith. He says, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Ma ba'ath Allahu nabiyyan illa ra'al ghanam." Allah did not send any prophet into this world except that they were shepherds. Meaning, every single prophet of Allah who came into this world did some shepherding, right? Looked after some animals and a flock. And so the Sahaba, they asked, "Wa anta, ya Rasulullah, what about you?" The Prophet ﷺ said, "Naam kuntu ar'aha ala qararita li ahli Makkah." The Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Yes, I also tended some flocks of the people of Mecca in exchange for a payment." So this was at a time when he was under the care of his uncle Abu Talib, who was not a wealthy person but had many children and was struggling. And the Prophet ﷺ, he did his part to help the household. And one of the reasons, the hikmah, look, there must be a huge divine wisdom in this. If every single prophet of Allah did some shepherding, what is it? One of the key things that the ulama have mentioned is that a shepherd, number one, he disconnects from the rest of the world. His key priority becomes his flock and the protection of his flock. And this is something that it nurtures these sentiments of protecting. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, remember in one of his very famous hadiths, the Prophet ﷺ says, my example with you is like a person who is standing on the edge of a cliff, and I'm holding on to you by your waist strap, trying to protect you from falling into the hellfire. So this is that sense of protection, of nurturing, of looking after and caring for. It brings that to the forefront, and this is something that every single prophet did. The last hadith in this chapter, and the last hadith that we'll finish with today, narrated also by Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he says, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Min khayri ma'ashin nasi lahum rajulun mumsikun inana farasihi fi sabilillah." That one of the best livelihoods for people is that of a man who holds on to the reins of his horse in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yatiru ala matnihi, jumping onto its back. Kullama sami'a hay'atan aw faz'atan, every single time that he hears of any military expedition, he jumps onto the back of his horse. Tara alayhi, he travels on it. Yabtaghi al-qatla, seeking out that military expedition. Awil maut, or his own death, his own shahada, his own martyrdom. Mazanahu, so that's what he's seeking, that's what he's desiring. Aw rajulun fi ghunaymatin fi ra'si sha'afatin min hadhihi sha'af. That was one. That's a good livelihood. Or the Prophet ﷺ said, the person who tends to his sheep on one of the mountain tops from these valleys that are around you, أو بطن واد من هذه الأودية, or one of the valleys between the mountains. يقيم الصلاة, he's establishing the salah. ويؤتي الزكاة, he's paying his zakah. ويعبد ربه حتى يأتيه اليقين, and he is worshipping his Lord until he is absolutely certain. Right? He has yaqeen and certainty in his belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ليس من الناس إلا في خير. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that he doesn't meddle in the affairs of people except for good. He doesn't involve himself amongst the people except for that which is good. These are the two best kind of people in the sight of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the one thing we can do, it's difficult for us, perhaps to get a flock of sheep and go off into the mountains or the valleys or whatever. But think of this as the valley and the fortress, in fact, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And come to the masjid, pray with the jama'ah, with the congregation as frequently as possible, and fortify yourself in this fortress of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That takes us up to chapter number 70, which is the virtues of mixing with people. Islam is not a religion that promotes, being a hermit and secluding yourself from the whole world and cutting yourself off and not having any relations with people at all. Islam doesn't promote that. So the virtues of mixing with people, and then some of the adab and etiquette, inshallah, we'll be moving on to next time. And inshallah, as I had mentioned on Jumu'ah as well, there will be no halaqah in the next 2 weeks. So our next halaqah will be on the 2nd of September, Monday, 2nd of September, inshallah. I will be traveling for Umrah in a few days, and inshallah I'll be away for a couple of weeks. Join me in finishing our gathering as we have been doing with the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just for a few moments, and then inshallah we'll conclude with Fatiha and Duha. حسبي ربي جل الله ما في قلبي غير الله نور محمد صلى الله لا إله إلا 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 الله 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 لا إله 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 إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم. الفاتحة إلى روح النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمद وबारिक वसल्लम। या रब्बल आलमीन, हमारी इस मजलिस को अपनी बारगाह में शर्फ कबूल अता फरमा। तिलावत कलाम मजीद, दरूद पाक, दर्स हदीस, ज़िक्र पाक और जितनी भी मजलिस है इलाहुल आलमीन, सब में हमारी शिरकत को, हमारी शमूलियत को, इस मजलिस को अपनी बारगाह में मकबूल व मंजूर फरमा। फातिहा शरीफ पर या रब्बल आलमीन अपनी शान करीमी के मुताबिक अजर व सवाब अता फरमा। इसका सवाब नबी अकरम नूर मुजस्सम सल्लल्लाहु ताला अलैहि वसल्लम की बारगाह में हदिया अकीदत पेश करते हैं, मकबूल व मंजूर फरमा। आपके वसीला जलीला से जमी अम्बिया किराम, आपके वालिदैन करीमैन, आपके जुमला आबा व अजदाद, जमी सहाबा सहाबियात, अज़वाज मुतहहारात, अहले बैत अतहार, सबकी बारगाह में पेश करते हैं, मकबूल व मंजूर फरमा। या रब्बल आलमीन, इन अपने नेक मुकर्रब बंदों के तुफ़ैल जमी मोमिनीन मोमिनात को इसका सवाब अता फरमा। इलाहुल आलमीन, खुसूसन बिलखुसूस हम सब के हाज़रीन के वालिदैन में से आबा व अजदाद, हमारे आइज़ा अक़रबा, असातिज़ा, मशाइख़, दोस्त, अहबाब, हम पर हक रखने वाले जितने भी अहले ईमान इस दुनिया से चले गए, इलाहुल आलमीन सबको इसका सवाब अता फरमा, सबकी बख्शिश और मग़फ़िरत फरमा, सबको जन्नतुल फ़िरदौस में आला मक़ाम अता फरमा। इलाहुल आलमीन, उनके साथ हमें भी जन्नत में जगह अता फरमा। इलाहुल आलमीन, हम सब के हाल पर अपना ख़ास फज़ल व करम फरमा, उम्मत मुस्लिमा की खैर फरमा। या रब्बल आलमीन, हम सबको शान से ज़िंदा रख और ईमान पर ख़ात्मा अता फरमा। या रब्बल आलमीन, हम सब की दिली नेक मुराद को पूरा फरमा। व सल्लल्लाहु तआला अला खैरि खल्क़िही मुहम्मद व अला आलिहि व अस्हाबिही।